I am stopping the service. Perhaps I'm at this moment refocusing the service, but actually probably a better description is that I'm interrupting the service intentionally because our lives this week have been interrupted again. 14 people have died. 21 people injured. And I am fearful. Perhaps you are too. I am fearful. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not afraid that I'm going to become a victim of violence. That's not really where my fear comes from. If truth be told, what I'm most fearful of is that violence will become an accepted norm in our culture. And if I really want to name my darkest fear, and perhaps this rings true for you too, it is that violence has already become an accepted norm in our culture. Decades ago, polio swept across our great nation and was the scourge of society. Most of you know people, and perhaps you even were touched by polio. My mother had polio, and our nation looked at this and they were fearful. I didn't live through it, but folks who lived through it talk about the swimming pools closing and public events shutting down, and fear swept throughout our nation. And yet something interesting happened. We as a nation collectively came together with the strongest medical response any society has ever seen in the history of the world. Because what we said is this will not be allowed to become a norm. Polio will not be part of our daily lives. We took it on and we focused on it until we were certain that it was no longer a threat for our world. Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Columbine, Emmanuel Church, Charleston, and now San Bernardino, California. And that's just a fraction of the list. We cannot allow violence. We cannot allow murder. We cannot allow the slaughter of innocents in our society to become an acceptable part of our lives. The New York Times ran an article last week. Perhaps you read it. It was on the front page of the New York Times, and it had this information. If you define mass shootings in our culture as any that have 4 or more of the victims die, do you know how often that happens in our society? The New York Times said over the span of the last 5 years, we have averaged 1 mass shooting a day. The tragedy that happened in San Bernardino, California, is not simply that 14 people were murdered. It was that those 14 people's names seem to be needlessly now added to a list of names that is thousands and thousands of people long just in the last couple of years. The tragedy for us is that violence has become the new normal. The truth is that violence has become the accepted background noise that we ignore in our daily lives. And it will remain that way until we are willing to acknowledge and openly admit that it is a disease that infects every single aspect of our society. God help us. Please, God, help us. Help us to be strong enough to let this be a turning point. Help us to be strong enough to change. Help us to be strong enough to insist on change. To absolutely, without wavering, demand change until no one in our society ever dies like this again. Amen.